They say blood is thicker than water. But what they don't tell you is that money, and the hunger for it, can be a poison that turns blood to venom, leaving the deepest of wounds not on the skin, but on the soul. In the heart of Boston, inside a law office that felt more like a mausoleum, Ethan Hayes was learning this lesson firsthand. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and polished mahogany, and the only sound was the rhythmic drumming of rain against the 40th floor window, a gray curtain falling on a life he thought he knew. The silence in the room was a physical weight, pressing down on him as the family lawyer. A man named Albright, whose face was a mask of professional sympathy, slid a single, sealed envelope across the vast, empty desk. Just moments before, that same voice had methodically dismantled Ethan's world. The last will and testament of his father, Richard Hayes, had been read. The sprawling construction empire, the vast portfolio of properties, the carefully curated collection of art, everything. It was all left to Isabella, his father's second wife, and her son, Leo. Ethan's name was never mentioned. It was a complete erasure, a surgical removal from the legacy he was born into. But it wasn't the money that made the air leave his lungs. Ethan had built his own successful architecture firm. He didn't need his father's fortune. It was the absolute, cold finality of the act. To be rendered a stranger, a footnote not even worthy of a mention. The envelope felt impossibly heavy in his hands. His father's name was written on the front, the familiar, strong script, now looking alien, menacing. With numb fingers, he broke the seal. The crisp tear of paper sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. And then he read. The words on the page were not just ink, they were daggers, each one forged in his father's own hand and aimed directly at his heart. They spoke of disappointment. They accused him of a greed he never felt, of a disrespect he never showed. The letter painted a picture of a son who was a burden, a parasite, a failure. It was a character assassination, a final, posthumous blow from the man who had taught him the meaning of integrity. As Ethan's eyes scanned the last, damning sentence, the rain outside seemed to blur into the polished surface of the desk. The grief over his father's passing was suddenly eclipsed by a new, more profound agony. This was not just a disinheritance. This was a betrayal that reached back through time, poisoning every memory, every shared laugh, every piece of fatherly advice. He felt the foundation of his entire life crack beneath him, leaving him in a free fall of confusion and heartbreak. The man described in the letter, that monster of greed and ingratitude, was a stranger to Ethan. He did not exist in the vast, sunlit corridors of his memory. The father Ethan knew, the Richard Hayes, who had built not just a construction empire, but Ethan's entire world, was the man who smelled of sawdust and ambition, the man whose hands, though calloused from work, could fix any broken toy and steady any trembling chin. To understand the depth of the betrayal, you have to understand the world that was stolen. Before Isabella, there was Eleanor. And the three of them, Richard, Eleanor, and Ethan, were a self-contained universe. Their home in Brookline wasn't a sterile mansion of new money, but a sprawling stone house filled with the warmth of his mother's laughter and the weight of his father's presence. Richard was a force of nature, a man carved from the same granite he used to build his skyscrapers. He was demanding, exacting, and believed that success was a duty, not a gift. Yet, this formidable figure would spend entire Saturday afternoons on the floor with a young Ethan, not just playing, but teaching. Ethan remembered one winter a blizzard had buried the city in a thick blanket of white. He must have been 10 years old. While other fathers were outside helping their sons build snowmen, Richard Hayes had cleared the great mahogany table in his study and laid out the blueprints for a miniature cantilever bridge. For 2 days they worked, measuring tiny balsa wood beams, mixing industrial-grade epoxy, and debating the physics of load-bearing structures. A structure is only as strong as its foundation, Ethan, Richard had said, his voice a low rumble. It's the part no one sees, the part that gets none of the glory, but it holds everything up. Without it, the whole beautiful, shiny thing comes crashing down. Never forget that. In buildings and in life. That was his father. Every moment was a lesson. Every interaction, a deposit into the bank of Ethan's character. His mother, Eleanor, was the brilliant, gentle architect of their family's heart. Where Richard was the foundation, she was the light and air that made the house a home. She was the one who could soothe Richard's temper with a quiet touch, the one who taught Ethan that strength wasn't just about being the loudest voice in the room, but also about knowing when to listen. She filled their home with art and music, and it was from her that Ethan inherited his eye for design and his quieter, more observant nature. Her death from a sudden illness was not a crack in their foundation, it was a tectonic shift that broke it clean in two. The light in the house went out. Richard, a man who could command boardrooms and bend city planners to his will, was utterly lost. He buried himself in his work, the Hayes construction tower in the heart of Boston, growing taller as the man himself seemed to shrink. Ethan, then in his early 20s and just starting his own career, tried to bridge the chasm of their shared grief. They had dinners, stiff and formal at first, that slowly softened into a new kind of companionship, a bond between two men mourning the same Sunday. Ethan saw his father's loneliness, a vast, echoing emptiness in the evenings, when the phone stopped ringing and the silence of the big house became a roar. And it was into this precise vacuum that Isabella floated, as if carried by a gentle breeze. Ethan first met her at a hospital charity gala. His father, as a major donor, was the guest of honor. Isabella was introduced as the widow of a Swiss banker, a woman of quiet elegance and profound grace. She wasn't ostentatious or loud. She was the opposite. Dressed in a simple, dark silk gown, she possessed a stillness that drew people in. She listened, her head tilted with an artist's focus, as his father spoke about the challenges of urban development. She didn't flatter him with empty compliments. She asked intelligent questions, showing a surprising grasp of engineering principles. She spoke of her own loss with a soft, resigned sadness that resonated deeply with Richard's own. To Ethan, she seemed perfect, almost too perfect. He was happy for his father, truly. For the first time in years, he saw a genuine light return to Richard's eyes, a lightness to his step. Isabella was a master of her craft. She never criticized Eleanor, but instead praised her, creating a seamless bridge from the past to the present. She would remark on Eleanor's exquisite taste in art, or how she could tell from Richard's stories what a remarkable woman she must have been. She made Richard feel like he wasn't betraying his late wife's memory, but honoring it by choosing to live again. She effortlessly filled the spaces Eleanor had left, reviving old dinner party traditions, learning the names of Richard's oldest friends and business partners, and showing a keen interest in the operations of Hayes Construction. She never asked for anything, which, ironically, made Richard want to give her everything. When his father announced their engagement 6 months later, Ethan gave his blessing without hesitation. The wedding was a small, tasteful affair at the city courthouse, followed by a dinner at their favorite restaurant. Seeing his father smile, a real, unburdened smile, Ethan felt a sense of relief. He thought the foundation of their family, so badly broken, was finally being repaired. He believed his father had found a companion for his final years, a gentle harbor in which to anchor his lonely soul. He didn't see the truth. He didn't see that he wasn't witnessing a repair. He was watching, with his own 2 eyes, as a patient, calculating artist covered the jagged cracks with a beautiful, flawless, and utterly false facade. The foundation wasn't being fixed. It was being buried. The first year of their marriage was, on the surface, a renaissance for Richard Hayes. The deep-set lines of grief around his eyes seemed to soften, replaced by a contentment Ethan hadn't seen in years. Isabella was a perfect partner, a socialite who moved through Boston's elite circles with an effortless grace, always reflecting the best of Richard back at him, making him feel wittier, stronger, more alive. Ethan, watching from a slight distance, allowed himself to hope. He told himself that his father deserved this happiness, this tranquil second chapter. But change, like a rising tide, often begins with movements so small they are almost imperceptible. It started with the phone calls. Ethan had always been able to reach his father directly, their conversations a comfortable mix of business and family. Now, more often than not, Isabella would answer. "Oh, Ethan, darling, Her voice would be like warm honey. "Your father is just resting. Let me take a message. I'll be sure he gets it." The messages were always relayed, but the immediacy, the casual connection between father and son, was now filtered through her. Then, she began to manage his schedule. It was a loving gesture, she insisted. Richard was working too hard, and he needed someone to protect his time. She would coordinate his appointments, board meetings, and even his weekly lunches with Ethan. What was once a simple call became a negotiation with his new stepmother. "Thursday looks difficult, Ethan. Richard has a follow-up with his cardiologist. How about next week? Let me see." Each act was shrouded in the language of care and concern, making any objection seem selfish and ungrateful. Isabella was building a wall around Richard, but she was using the most beautiful, expensive bricks of love and devotion, making it impossible for anyone to criticize the construction. It was 6 months into the marriage that the second major component of her plan arrived. Her son, Leo, appeared on their doorstep like a character from a tragic play. He was handsome in a soft, unused way, with his mother's charming smile and a story of a tech startup in California that had crashed and burned, leaving him with a broken heart and empty pockets. He just needed a place to stay for a few weeks, he said, to get his bearings. Richard, energized by his new life and eager to play the benevolent patriarch, welcomed him with open arms. Ethan disliked Leo instantly, a gut reaction he couldn't fully explain. Leo was a master of flattery, a sycophant of the highest order. He would hang on Richard's every word, praising his business acumen, his legendary negotiation tactics, his impeccable taste in art. "You're a legend, Richard," he'd say over dinner, his eyes wide with manufactured awe. "I just hope I can achieve a tenth of what you have." While Ethan and his father's bond was built on a foundation of mutual, often unspoken, respect, Leo's was built on a constant stream of effusive praise that Richard, to Ethan's dismay, seemed to drink in like a fine wine. The few weeks stretched into a permanent residence. Leo became a fixture in the house, a well-dressed parasite who contributed nothing but cheerful conversation. He drove Richard's spare Mercedes, held business meetings at his father-in-law's country club, and spoke vaguely of new ventures that were always just about to take off. Isabella played the part of the anxious mother perfectly, confiding in Richard how worried she was for Leo, how much she appreciated his guidance and mentorship of her boy. The first crack, the one that proved the beautiful facade was just that, appeared not in the house, but on a spreadsheet. Ethan, as a minority shareholder and board member of Hayes Construction, still received the quarterly financial reports. As he reviewed the numbers one evening, his architect's eye for detail caught an anomaly. It was a new line item under operational expenses, a significant, 5-figure monthly payment to a firm called Orion Strategic Consulting. He'd never heard of them. No one on the board had ever mentioned hiring a new consultancy. A cold knot of dread began to form in his stomach. He did some quiet digging. Orion Strategic Consulting had been incorporated just 4 months prior. It had no website, no list of clients, and its registered address was a commercial mail drop box in Delaware. With the help of a friend in corporate law, he pulled the incorporation documents. The sole officer of the LLC was a name he didn't recognize, but the secondary contact listed on the bank account setup was Leo. Ethan felt a surge of cold, clear anger. It was a classic, blatant scheme. Siphoning money from the company through a fake consulting gig. He had to tell his father. He decided to approach it carefully, not as an accusation, but as a point of concern. He arranged to meet his father at the house, specifically in his study, the room where they had built the bridge, the room that had always been their sanctuary. Richard was in a good mood, and Ethan waited, trying to find the right words. "Dad," he began, spreading the financial report on the desk. "I was looking over the Q3 numbers, and I had a question about this consulting firm, Orion." Before he could finish, the study door opened silently. Isabella entered, carrying a silver tray with a teapot and 2 cups. She smiled, a perfect picture of domestic grace. "I thought you two might like some tea," she said, her eyes flicking from Ethan's face to the papers on the desk. She caught the name Orion, and her serene expression didn't change, But Ethan saw a flicker, a momentary tightening in her gaze. She placed the tray down, her movements unhurried. "Is everything all right, Ethan? You look so serious." "I was just asking about a new company expense," Ethan said, keeping his tone level. "It seems quite substantial for a firm nobody's heard of." Isabella let out a soft, almost pitying laugh. She turned to Richard, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Oh, Richard, darling. That's Leo's new venture. I told you about it. He's providing digital marketing insights for the new condo developments. He's been working so hard on it. He didn't want anyone to know until he could show real results. He wanted to impress you." The lie was so smooth, so effortless, it was breathtaking. She had taken his discovery and transformed it into a story of a young man's ambition. Ethan stared at her, stunned into silence. "Leo's firm?" he finally managed to say. "Dad, this is a shell corporation. There's no work being done." Isabella's face fell, not into anger, but into a mask of deep, theatrical hurt. "Ethan, why would you say that? Do you have so little faith in your father's judgment?" Richard approved this himself. Leo presented him with a brilliant strategy. "Are you accusing us? Accusing your father? Of being a fool?" The argument was no longer about the money. In an instant, she had reframed it as a question of loyalty, of trust in Richard's authority. Ethan looked at his father, pleading with his eyes for him to see the obvious deception, but Richard's face had hardened. His pride had been wounded. He looked from his loving, defensive wife to his suspicious, accusing son. "That's enough," Richard said, his voice low and dangerous. It was the first time he had ever used that tone with Ethan. "Isabella is right. I approved the expense. Leo is family now, and he's trying to make something of himself. I will not have you come into my home and question my decisions or insult my wife. The matter is closed." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp as broken glass. The sanctuary of the study felt violated, contaminated. Ethan looked at the man he had idolized his entire life and saw a stranger, his eyes clouded by a comforting lie he desperately wanted to believe. He had come with facts, with evidence, with concern, but he had walked into a trap, and as he left the house that evening, the carefully constructed wall around his father now seemed 1,000 feet high. The first crack had appeared, and through it, Ethan could see a darkness he never knew existed. The confrontation over Orion Strategic Consulting did not end when Ethan walked out of his father's study. It lingered, a toxic fog that poisoned the air between them. The easy, weekly lunches stopped. Phone calls became brief and stilted, circling around safe, impersonal topics like the weather or the stock market. Richard was stubbornly proud, and Isabella had given him a narrative that allowed him to see himself as the victim of his son's suspicion rather than the target of his wife's deception. Ethan gave his father space, hoping the anger would cool and reason would prevail. He was wrong. The silence wasn't a temporary truce. It was a strategic opportunity, and Isabella exploited it with chilling precision. The true escalation began with a phone call not from his father, but from his father's frantic personal assistant. Richard Hayes had collapsed during a quarterly budget meeting. It was his heart. By the time Ethan arrived at Massachusetts General Hospital, the floor was already a fortress, with Isabella as its calm, composed commander. She stood in the stark white hallway outside the CCU, her face a perfect mask of worried devotion. She intercepted Ethan before he could even reach the door. "Ethan," she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "Thank you for coming, but you can't go in. He's stable, but the doctors have been very clear. Absolutely no stress." "I need to see him," Ethan insisted, his own heart hammering against his ribs. Isabella placed a hand on his arm, her touch surprisingly firm. "And you will," she said, her eyes welling with strategic tears. "But the last time you two spoke, it was a heated discussion. The doctors believe that emotional agitation may have contributed to this episode. We have to be careful. For his sake. Please, Ethan, let him rest." It was the perfect checkmate. She had taken his love for his father and turned it into a weapon against him. To argue would be to prove her point, to appear as the selfish son who would risk his father's health for his own needs. Defeated, Ethan could only nod and retreat, watching as she turned and slipped back into the hospital room, the sole guardian of the man he was forbidden to see. When Richard was discharged a week later, Isabella insisted he recover at home. "The hospital is so impersonal," she announced to the family and a few close business partners. "I'll hire the best private care. I can manage everything and ensure he has the peace and quiet he needs." And with that, the invisible wall that had been slowly rising between Ethan and his father was replaced by a physical one. The sprawling stone house in Brookline, once the center of Ethan's universe, became an impenetrable fortress. The long, winding driveway was now blocked by wrought iron gates that were, for the first time in Ethan's memory, always closed. His attempts to communicate became a maddening exercise in futility. He would call his father's cell phone, a number he had known by heart since he was a teenager. It would ring and ring, then click to voicemail. The mailbox was always full. He would call the house landline. Isabella would answer, her voice consistently calm and regretful. "Oh, Ethan, you just missed him. He's just gone down for his nap." Or, "The doctor was just here and gave him a mild sedative. He won't be coherent for a few hours." Or, the most cutting excuse of all, "He's just not feeling up to speaking with you today, darling. His energy is very low." Ethan tried visiting in person, driving up to the imposing gates and buzzing the intercom. Isabella's disembodied voice would float through the speaker, full of gentle admonishment. "Ethan, we've talked about this. You can't just show up unannounced. It disrupts his routine. I promise I will tell him you stopped by." He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she was lying. He imagined her turning from the intercom, a triumphant smile gracing her lips, and telling his father nothing. She was creating an echo chamber inside that house, a world where she was the only voice Richard heard, the only source of information he had. She was meticulously crafting a new reality for him, one in which his only son was a distant, troublesome figure, a source of agitation and heartache. Ethan could almost hear her whispered words, spoken over a cup of herbal tea by his father's bedside. "Richard, darling," Ethan called again. He was asking about the company shares. "I told him now wasn't the time. I don't know why he keeps bringing up these stressful business matters when you're so unwell. It's like he doesn't care about your recovery, only about the inheritance." It was a slow, methodical poisoning, a narrative of neglect and greed being dripped into his father's ear day after day, while Ethan was left on the outside, powerless to defend himself. His frustration curdled into a desperate, gnawing anxiety. He was fighting a ghost, an enemy who cloaked her aggression in the guise of love. He tried to circumvent her, reaching out to his father's oldest friends, men who had known him for decades. But the poison had spread. "I spoke with Isabella," one of them told him, his voice laced with pity. "She's a saint, that woman, taking care of him day and night. She mentioned you two had a falling out over some business deal." "It's a shame, Ethan. You shouldn't be putting your father through that at a time like this." She had gotten to them all first. She had painted the picture, and it was a masterpiece of deception: the devoted wife, the ailing husband, and the greedy, impatient son. The days turned into weeks. Ethan's life became a miserable cycle of unanswered calls and fruitless drives to the closed gates of his own childhood home. On one particularly bleak afternoon, he parked down the street and simply watched the house as the sun began to set. Lights flickered on in the windows, casting a warm, inviting glow. Inside, his father was sitting, breathing, living a life that no longer included him. He was a stone's throw away, yet he might as well have been on another planet. The feeling of helplessness was a physical sickness, a crushing weight in his chest. He wasn't just losing his father to an illness. He was losing him to an expert thief, a woman who was stealing not just his money, but his memories, his relationships, and his very identity as a beloved son, all while the world applauded her for her unwavering devotion. The weeks of forced silence had stretched Ethan's nerves to a breaking point. Every unanswered call, every hollow excuse from Isabella twisted the knot of helpless anxiety in his gut. He was trapped in a nightmare of inaction, watching the home of his youth from a distance, a ghost haunting his own life. The breaking point, the thing that finally propelled him to shatter the glass wall of Isabella's design, came not as a shout, but as a whispered, fearful phone call. It was from Maria, his father's personal assistant of 30 years, a woman who had been a quiet, constant presence his entire life. Isabella had persuaded her into an early retirement a month prior, replacing her with someone younger, someone with no prior loyalty to the Hayes family. "Ethan," Maria's voice was trembling, "I shouldn't be calling, but I still have friends in the accounting department. I couldn't let it happen." She told him that Isabella, using a recently acquired power of attorney, had initiated the sale of a significant portfolio of undeveloped land in the Berkshires. It wasn't just any land. It was a passion project of Richard's, a pristine tract of forest and hills he had been slowly acquiring for decades. He called it Eleanor's Grove and had always told Ethan that it would never be developed, that it was a piece of untouched beauty to be passed down through generations. Isabella and Leo weren't just selling it, they were selling it through a complex series of shell corporations for a fraction of its market value to a holding company that, after some frantic digging by Maria's contacts, was traced back to Leo. They weren't just siphoning cash anymore. They were liquidating his father's soul, piece by piece. That was the last straw. There would be no more polite phone calls, no more buzzing at the gate. This was an act of war. Fueled by a righteous, white-hot fury, Ethan drove to Brookline. He didn't bother with the main gate. He drove around to a small, nearly hidden service entrance at the back of the property, one used by the gardeners. He punched in a 4-digit code from his childhood, a code he and his father had set up for him to use when he forgot his keys. A prayer and a curse left his lips, and he heard the soft click of the lock disengaging. Isabella, in all her meticulous planning, had overlooked this small, ancient detail. He parked his car behind a row of manicured hedges and walked towards the house, his heart pounding a furious rhythm against his ribs. He still had his old key, a piece of brass he hadn't used in years. It slid into the lock of the side kitchen door and turned. The house was silent. He walked through the familiar halls, now a stranger in his own museum. He found them in the sunroom, the scene a perfect, sickening tableau of domestic peace. Richard was dozing in a large leather recliner, a cashmere blanket draped over his legs. He looked smaller, more frail than Ethan had ever seen him. Leo was scrolling lazily on his phone, and Isabella was sitting opposite her husband, reading a magazine, the picture of wifely tranquility. Ethan's sudden appearance shattered the silence. Isabella looked up, her eyes widening first in shock, and then immediately hardening into cold fury. Leo shot to his feet. Richard stirred, his eyes fluttering open, confused. "What is this?" Ethan's voice was dangerously low, and he threw a folder of printed documents onto the coffee table between them. The papers scattered, detailing the land sale, the shell companies, Leo's name. "Eleanor's Grove. You're selling Eleanor's Grove." Isabella stood up, recovering instantly, moving to place herself protectively in front of Richard's chair. "Ethan, my God, you burst in here like a madman. Look at you. You're frightening your father." "I'm frightening him?" Ethan's voice rose, a raw cry of disbelief. "You are stealing his legacy from under him while he sleeps, and I'm the one who's frightening?" "Get out of here," Leo shouted, stepping forward, his face red and puffy. "You have no right to be here. Can't you see you're upsetting a sick man?" Ethan ignored him, his eyes locked on his father, who was now fully awake, his breathing shallow. "Dad, look at the papers, please. It's all there. She's selling your land. Leo is stealing from you." He tried to explain, his words tumbling out in a torrent of desperation, pointing to the names, the companies, the undervalued prices. But his passion, his righteous anger, sounded like hysteria in the quiet room. Isabella began to cry. It was a masterful performance. Her shoulders shook, and she hid her face in her hands, her sobs quiet and heartbreaking. "Richard, I don't know what he's talking about," she wept. "We were just trying to liquidate some non-performing assets to simplify the portfolio, to reduce your stress. The doctors said. They said to reduce your stress." "Simplify?" Ethan laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "You call this simplification? This is theft." It was then that Richard, who had been watching the scene with cloudy, confused eyes, finally found his voice. He had been marinating for months in Isabella's poison, fed a steady diet of his son's greed and insensitivity. Now, he saw the scene exactly as she had framed it, his hysterical, accusatory son and his weeping, devoted wife. The final switch in his mind flipped. Enough. The word was a roar, a surprising surge of the old Richard Hayes. He struggled to sit up straighter in his chair, his face a mask of purple rage. "I have had enough of your accusations, your obsession with my money." "It's not about the money, Dad. It's about her," Ethan pleaded, pointing a shaking finger at Isabella. Richard slapped his hand down on the arm of the recliner. "Her? Her name is Isabella. She is my wife. She has been here, taking care of me, day and night, while you have been doing nothing but trying to stir up trouble. All you've ever cared about is what you'll get when I'm gone." The words were Isabella's, but the voice was his father's, and that made it 1,000 times more painful. "I see you now," Richard snarled, his voice trembling with a fury that seemed to drain the very life from him. "I see you for what you really are, disrespectful, ungrateful. Your mother would be ashamed of you." That was the final blow. It landed with the force of a physical impact, stealing the breath from Ethan's lungs. He stared at his father, at the stranger sitting in his chair, and all the fight went out of him. He was defeated. He saw the flicker of cold triumph in Isabella's eyes, even as she continued to sob into her hands. Richard raised a trembling arm and pointed toward the door. "Get out," he rasped, his breath catching in his chest. "Get out of my house, and don't you dare come back. As of this moment, you are no longer my son." There was nothing left to say. The words, so final, so absolute, hung in the air, severing the last thread of their bond. Ethan looked one last time at the man in the chair, the hollowed-out shell of his hero, and then he turned and walked away. He didn't run. He walked, in a numb daze, back through the silent halls, out the side door, and into the cold afternoon air. The heavy oak door swinging shut behind him wasn't just a sound. It was the end of his world. The weeks that followed the final, brutal argument were a gray, featureless landscape of time. Ethan learned of his father's death not from a personal call, but from a short, sterile news alert on his phone. Richard Hayes, titan of industry, philanthropist, dead at 68. He attended the funeral, a spectator at his own father's farewell. He sat in a back pew, a ghost in a well-tailored suit, watching as Isabella, draped in black lace and inconsolable grief, accepted condolences from the city's most powerful people. He saw the pitying, sometimes judgmental, glances thrown his way. Isabella's narrative had become public knowledge. The difficult, greedy son who had broken his ailing father's heart. He didn't try to correct them. He didn't have the strength. Then came the meeting in the lawyer's office, the final, formal severing. And now, days later, Ethan sat in the silence of his own apartment, a space known for its clean lines and minimalist design, now cluttered with the wreckage of his thoughts. The city of Boston hummed with life 30 stories below, a world he was no longer a part of. He was in an abyss, a place of profound and suffocating pain. The grief was a multi-headed beast. He grieved for the father he had lost to death, but he also grieved for the father he had lost months before that, the man who had looked at him with eyes full of hatred and spoken words that had flayed his soul. That last memory was a wound that would not close, replaying itself in an endless, agonizing loop. And on the polished concrete coffee table in front of him lay the instrument of his torture, the letter. For 3 days it sat there. A white rectangle of poison. He would pace the apartment, avoiding the sight of it, only to find his eyes drawn back again and again. It was the summation of his failure, the final, damning judgment on his life as a son. This morning, something shifted. The deep, aching sorrow had not vanished, but it had made room for something else, something cold and sharp. Numbly, he walked to the table, picked up the single sheet of expensive stationery, and forced himself to read it again. He read it not as a son, but as an architect examining a flawed blueprint. He dissected every sentence, every word choice. And as he did, the first seeds of doubt began to sprout in the barren ground of his despair. His father, for all his temper and pride, was a direct man. His anger was a thunderstorm, loud and violent, but it passed. This letter was different. It was not the writing of a man in a rage. It was cold, calculated, and theatrical. It used phrases Richard Hayes would never use. A profound disappointment. His father would have just said, "You let me down." An obsession with financial matters. His father would have said, "You only care about the money." Then he saw it, a single word that unlocked everything. The letter accused him of being disruptive to his father's peace and recovery. Disruptive. It was Isabella's word. She had used it countless times on the intercom, on the phone. "You're being disruptive, Ethan." It was a piece of her vocabulary, a piece of her poison, now rendered in his father's handwriting. He read the letter again, and this time he could hear her voice, her soft, manipulative cadence, dictating every line. The accusations of greed were a perfect echo of her defense of the Orion consulting scheme. The claims of his disrespect were the exact narrative she had spun after he had stormed the house. The letter wasn't a confession, it was a script. It was the final scene of a long, brilliant performance, and his father, weak, medicated, and isolated, had been forced to play the lead role. A new feeling began to displace the grief. It was a cold, hard anger, clearer and more powerful than any rage he had felt before. The man who signed this letter was his father, yes, but the author was Isabella. This wasn't a family tragedy. It was a crime scene. The injustice of it all, the sheer, calculated cruelty, was a clarion call. He would not let this stand. He would not let his father's memory be this ugly, twisted lie. He would not let them win. His purpose, which had been lost in a fog of pain, was now crystal clear. This was not about reclaiming the money. He didn't care about the fortune. This was about reclaiming the truth. It was about clawing back his own name, and more importantly, the name of the man who had taught him that a foundation built on lies would always, eventually, crumble. The lethargy that had held him captive for weeks vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. He walked to his desk, his movements now precise and deliberate. He needed help, not a lawyer to contest the will, not yet. He needed an investigator, someone who could dig into the dark, hidden places of people's lives. He needed someone who could unearth the foundation of Isabella's lies. A name came to him instantly. David Chen, a retired legend from the SEC's Enforcement Division, a man who could smell financial fraud from a mile away. David had been a friend of his father's for years, a regular at their old Sunday barbecues before Eleanor had passed. He was brilliant, relentless, and he knew, and deeply respected, the Richard Hayes of the past. He would understand. Ethan found the number. He picked up his phone, his hand perfectly steady. The man who made the call was not the broken son who had stumbled out of the lawyer's office. This was someone new, someone forged in the fire of betrayal and grief. David Chen picked up on the third ring. "David," Ethan said, his voice quiet, but as solid as steel. "It's Ethan Hayes. I'm sorry to bother you at home. I have a problem, and I need someone who can find the truth, no matter how ugly it island." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then David's calm, steady voice replied, "I was sorry to hear about your father, Ethan. Tell me everything." And as the sun set over the city, Ethan began to talk, laying out the blueprint of the crime that had been committed against his family. The fight had begun. The meeting took place not in a sterile office, but in the quiet, book-lined study of David Chen's brownstone in Beacon Hill. The air smelled of old paper and roasted coffee. David, a man in his late 60s with the sharp, intelligent eyes of a hawk and a demeanor of absolute calm, listened without interruption for nearly 2 hours as Ethan laid out the entire sordid story. He pushed a folder of his own research, the Orion documents, the land sale records across the desk. When Ethan finished, his voice raw with emotion, David simply nodded, his expression unreadable. He steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed on a point in the middle distance. "Grief is a storm, Ethan," David said finally, his voice calm and measured. "It clouds your judgment, makes you want to lash out. We can't afford that. To do this right, we have to put the grief in a box and lock it away for now. What we need is ice. We need logic, precision, and absolute certainty." He leaned forward, his focus sharpening. Forget the will. Contesting it is a fool's errand. It's a, he said, she said, against a dead man. They would paint you as the greedy son, and with that letter your father wrote, they would win. We don't attack the will. We attack the beneficiary. We don't try to prove your father was manipulated in his final months. We prove that Isabella Hayes has never been the person she claims to be. We dismantle her life, story by story, lie by lie, until the woman he married is revealed as a phantom. And so, the investigation began. David Chen was a master of his craft, a digital archaeologist who could resurrect the ghosts of people's pasts. He started with the official record, the carefully curated history of Isabella Hayes, born Isabella Rossi. On the surface, it was flawless. A degree in art history from a reputable university, a short, tragic marriage to a Swiss banker who died young, a modest inheritance, and then her whirlwind romance with Richard Hayes. It was clean, almost too clean. David's first rule of investigation was that perfection is a lie. He started with the gaps. Using proprietary databases that scraped old public records, he found what he was looking for. A 5-year period in Isabella's early 20s where her digital footprint was unusually faint. It was here, in the shadows, that he found the first thread. A woman named Isabel Roach, with a 98% probability match on date of birth and facial metrics from an old DMV photo, had obtained a marriage license in Naples, Florida. Her husband was Arthur Vance, a 72-year-old retired pharmaceutical executive. 18 months after the wedding, Arthur Vance died suddenly of a massive coronary event while on his boat. His children from a previous marriage were suspicious, but the autopsy confirmed a heart attack. Isabel Roach Vance, his grieving young widow, inherited his waterfront home and a $2 million life insurance policy. She sold the house within a month, liquidated the assets, and vanished. The name Isabel Roach ceased to exist. David kept digging. 3 years later, a woman named Bella Monet surfaced in Scottsdale, Arizona. She was a sophisticated art dealer who quickly integrated into the wealthy retiree community. She soon married Marcus Thorne, a real estate mogul with a known heart condition. They were married for 2 years before he died in a tragic hiking accident, falling from a ledge in Sedona. It was ruled an accident, but local whispers said it was strange he had gone hiking alone on such a treacherous trail. Bella Monet inherited a substantial trust fund, but not the bulk of the estate, which was tied up by his estranged children. Within 6 months, she too had disappeared. David worked for days, fueled by black coffee and a quiet, burning indignation on behalf of his old friend, Richard. He cross-referenced photos, tracked financial transactions through old bank records, and pieced together the trail. Isabel Roach, Bella Monet, and Isabella Hayes were, without a shadow of a doubt, the same person. She was a black widow, a predator who had refined her methods over 2 decades. She learned from her mistakes. With Arthur Vance, she had taken too much, too quickly, raising suspicion. With Marcus Thorne, she had been more subtle. Richard Hayes was to be her masterpiece, the culmination of a lifetime of predatory work. She had played the long game, earning his trust, integrating herself into his life, and preparing for the ultimate payout. While the story of Isabella's past was unfolding, David ran a parallel investigation into her son, Leo. The charming, failed entrepreneur was, as David suspected, a far more dangerous character than he appeared. He wasn't just a freeloader. He was the engine of their immediate greed. David's financial forensics uncovered a disastrous trail of debt. Leo was a high-stakes gambler, and he was deeply in the hole. There were credit lines from online betting sites, records of large cash advances at casinos in Atlantic City, and, most damningly, a series of structured payments to a known loan shark in Boston's North End. Leo's charm was a performance, a desperate act to maintain a lifestyle he couldn't afford and to keep his dangerous creditors at bay. His need for cash was not just a desire, it was a requirement for his own survival. This explained the urgency of the past year. The Orion consulting scheme wasn't just pocket money. It was a desperate transfusion to keep Leo afloat. The sale of Eleanor's Grove was a frantic attempt to secure a major payday. They couldn't afford to wait for Richard to die of natural causes. They were running out of time. A week after their first meeting, Ethan was back in David's study. This time, the desk was covered in a spider web of documents. There were photos of a younger Isabella with different husbands, copies of marriage certificates and death certificates, and a flowchart of bank transactions that snaked between states and identities. "This is who your father married, Ethan," David said, his voice devoid of emotion. "She's not a grieving widow. She is a career criminal. And her son isn't just a spoiled brat. He's a desperate man with dangerous debts. They didn't just stumble into your father's money, they targeted him. This was an operation." Ethan stared at the evidence, the story of his family's destruction laid out in black and white. The pain in his chest was no longer the dull ache of grief. It was a sharp, cold fire of absolute certainty. His father hadn't fallen in love. He had been hunted, expertly and ruthlessly, by a pair of predators who had been practicing for this their entire lives. He looked at David, his own eyes now as hard as the investigators. "This is her past," Ethan said. "How do we connect it to what she did to my father?" David leaned back, a grim look on his face. "This is the motive. This is the character. Now, we find the weapon." David Chen's study transformed into the war room for a silent, meticulous battle. The history of Isabella's crimes provided the motive, the why. Now, they needed the how and the what, the undeniable proof of her actions against Richard Hayes. David, with the quiet intensity of a bomb disposal expert, focused first on the money. It was his native language. "Amateurs steal," he explained to Ethan, pointing at a complex diagram on his whiteboard. "Professionals create systems to make money disappear. Our job is to follow the ghost." He started with the two known thefts, the Orion strategic consulting payments and the sale of Eleanor's Grove. Using a series of legal requests filed through a discreet contact in the state attorney's office, citing potential elder financial abuse, he began to pry open the necessary accounts. The trail was, as he expected, deliberately convoluted. The money from both schemes was first funneled into a domestic LLC registered in Delaware. From there, it was wired to a second shell company, this one based in Panama, a notorious haven for money laundering. For a week, it seemed the trail went cold. But David was patient. He knew that even the most careful criminals make one mistake. They always want to be able to touch their money. He analyzed the transaction patterns of the Panamanian account, looking for outflows. He found one, a series of large, regular transfers to a private wealth management account in the Cayman Islands. The account was held by something called the Monet Trust. It was the flicker of arrogance he had been looking for, a nod to her former identity, a secret joke she thought no one would ever understand. This was the hub, the financial heart of her operation, where millions of dollars siphoned from Richard's empire now sat, clean and untraceable. But owning an offshore account wasn't the final link. They needed to prove she and Leo were benefiting from it now, in the real world. David spent another 3 days pulling property and credit records for Leo. And there it was. 2 months ago, Leo had purchased a luxury penthouse condo in Miami's South Beach. A significant portion of the down payment had come from a wire transfer, originating from the very same Cayman bank that housed the Monet Trust. It was the smoking gun for the fraud. A direct, irrefutable line from the theft to the thief. "This will get them convicted of fraud, grand larceny, and a dozen other financial crimes," David said, his tone flat and professional. "They'll go to prison, but it won't change the narrative that your father turned on you. To do that, we need to prove she didn't just steal his money. We need to prove she stole his mind." David shifted his focus. He compiled a list of every person who had worked in the Hayes household during the last year of Richard's life: cooks, cleaners, gardeners, and, most importantly, the private nursing staff Isabella had hired after his first collapse. He began making quiet, careful calls. Most were dead ends. Most of the staff had been hired through an agency Isabella controlled and had signed ironclad non-disclosure agreements. Then he found a name that was different. A nurse named Sarah Jenkins, who had been fired abruptly, the reason listed in her agency file as gross professional misconduct. It was a career-killing accusation and a massive red flag for David. He and Ethan found her living in a small, tidy apartment in Quincy. She was a single mother in her late 40s, with kind eyes that were now filled with fear. When they first explained why they were there, she refused to speak, shaking her head, her face pale. "I can't," she whispered, twisting her hands in her lap. "I signed a contract. She'll ruin me. I'll lose my license." David began to explain the legal protections they could offer, but it was Ethan who broke through her fear. He didn't threaten or cajole. He simply spoke about his father. He described the man who taught him to build bridges, the man who used to read him stories, the vibrant, powerful man who had faded into a confused, angry stranger. "I don't understand what happened to him at the end," Ethan said, his voice thick with a pain that was raw and real. "I just want to understand. If you saw anything at all that could help me understand what they did to him, please." Sarah looked at Ethan, and her professional composure finally broke. Tears streamed down her face. She was a monster, she finally choked out. She did it all with a smile. Sarah explained that her primary job had been to administer Richard's complex cocktail of heart medications. Beta blockers to control his blood pressure, blood thinners, statins. It was a delicate balance. She noticed early on that Isabella would often dismiss her when it was time for the evening dose, insisting on giving Richard his medication herself. She would call it a tender, wifely moment. One evening, Sarah had returned to the room unexpectedly to retrieve her charts. She stopped in the doorway, unseen. She watched as Isabella, her back to the door, crushed a small pill and mixed the powder into the cup of chamomile tea she was preparing for Richard. It was one of his beta blockers, but it was an extra half dose, one that was not on his chart. Sarah knew instantly what that meant. An overdose wouldn't necessarily kill him, but it would drop his blood pressure, slow his heart rate, and critically, reduce blood flow to the brain. It would make him perpetually tired, foggy, and highly suggestible. It would amplify his confusion and paranoia. It was a form of chemical gaslighting. "I tried to question it," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I asked her the next morning if the doctor had changed his prescription, because he seemed so lethargic. I told her we needed to log any changes. She just smiled this cold, empty smile. The next day, a valuable diamond earring went missing from her jewelry box. She didn't accuse me outright, but she had the entire staff searched. The earring was found in the pocket of my coat. She fired me on the spot for theft and told me if I ever tried to make trouble, she would make sure the accusation was formally filed and I would never work as a nurse again. I had a daughter to feed. I was terrified. I stayed silent. Ethan sat there, the blood draining from his face. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. His father's fatigue, his growing confusion, his irrational anger during their final argument. He hadn't just been sick. He hadn't just been manipulated with words. He had been systematically, deliberately drugged, kept in a chemical prison where his own mind was no longer his own. The letter, the diabolical cruelty of it, was not written by his father. It was written by the puppet master who was pulling the strings, a woman who controlled the very thoughts in his head by controlling the medicine in his veins. The full monstrous scope of the conspiracy was now laid bare. This was not a story of greed. This was a story of a slow, quiet, and deliberate destruction of a human being. It was, in its own cold and calculated way, a murder. And the quiet resolve in Ethan's heart now hardened into something that felt like granite. He finally had the weapon David had been looking for. The revelation from Sarah Jenkins changed the very air in David Chen's study. The quiet, academic pursuit of facts was over. The cold case files of fraud and deception were now dripping with the warm, fresh blood of a far more intimate crime. They hadn't just stolen Richard Hayes's money. They had hijacked his mind, steering him toward a lonely, confused death while they picked his life apart. Ethan's grief, which had been a heavy shroud, was now incinerated by a white-hot, focused rage. He wanted more than legal restitution. He wanted justice, a raw and public reckoning that would be as theatrical and devastating as Isabella's own manipulations. He didn't have to wait long for the perfect stage to present itself. Isabella, in an act of supreme and fatal arrogance, announced it to the world. It appeared as a full-page, glossy advertisement in the Boston Globe Society magazine, a lavish, black-tie charity gala to be held in the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel. The event would be the official launch of a new philanthropic organization, and in a stroke of irony so profound it was almost poetic, the name was printed in elegant script beneath a professionally shot, smiling photograph of Isabella and Richard. It was to be called the Richard Hayes Foundation for Heart Health. Ethan stared at the advertisement, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. David, ever the pragmatist, saw it as a risk. This is her turf, Ethan. She controls the narrative, the guest list, the security. We should take our evidence to the DA and let the system handle it. But Ethan shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. A cold clarity had settled over him. No, he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. She used my father's illness as her weapon, and now she's using it as her shield to make herself a saint. She has spent 2 years building a masterpiece of lies in front of the whole city. She doesn't deserve to have it quietly dismantled in a courtroom. She needs to watch it burn down in front of everyone she ever tried to impress. She built the stage herself. I'm just going to write the final act. Their focus shifted from investigation to preparation for war. David's study became a media production house. The objective was to distill 2 decades of lies and a mountain of evidence into a presentation so clear, so concise, and so damning that it would be utterly irrefutable. David, with his forensic accountant's mind, handled the financial data. He created a series of stark, powerful infographics. The first was a flowchart titled The Money Trail, showing the smiling corporate logo of Hayes Construction at the top, with thick red arrows documenting the flow of millions through the Orion Shell Company into the Panamanian account, and finally landing in the Monet Trust in the Cayman Islands. A final arrow pointed from the trust to a picture of Leo's gleaming Miami penthouse, with the purchase price listed beneath it. The next slide was simply titled, The Wives of Richard Hayes. On one side was a beautiful photo of his mother, Eleanor, with her birth and death dates. On the other, a chilling triptych, 3 driver's license photos, digitally enhanced and placed side by side, Isabel Roach of Florida, Bella Monet of Arizona, and Isabella Hayes of Massachusetts. Beneath each photo was the name and picture of her dead husband and his cause of death: heart attack, hiking accident, heart failure. The pattern was stark and horrifying. The final and most crucial element was Sarah Jenkins' testimony. They worked with a top litigator to draft a formal affidavit, which Sarah, now under their legal protection, willingly signed. They would not show her face or name, but the words themselves were a sledgehammer. For the presentation, they took the most powerful lines and displayed them as white text on a black screen. She referred to it as his quiet medicine. I witnessed her administering unscheduled doses of beta blockers. She told me it helped keep him manageable. The logistics of the attack were planned with military precision. Getting into the event was the easy part. Ethan, as Richard Hayes' son, was a public figure. To deny him entry would raise more questions than it answered. He bought an entire table for 10 under his own name, a bold and public declaration of his intent to be there. The true challenge was seizing control of the ballroom's audiovisual system. David, using the quiet leverage of his old government connections, discovered which A divided by V company had the contract for the gala. He then tracked down the lead freelance technician for the event, a man named Marco. David and Ethan met him in a quiet coffee shop. They didn't threaten or blackmail him. They simply told him the truth, showed him a summary of their evidence, and made him an offer. A cash payment that would amount to a year's salary, and the moral satisfaction of helping to bring down a monster. Marco, a working-class guy with a deep-seated disdain for the performative charity of the super rich, agreed without a moment's hesitation. The plan was simple. Marco would ensure a specific laptop, provided by Ethan's team, was patched into the main video switcher. At the climax of Isabella's speech, when she cued a memorial video for Richard, Marco would hit a single button, switching the feed. With the arsenal prepared, David made the final move. He requested a clandestine meeting with a senior prosecutor in the district attorney's office, a man he had mentored years ago. In a sealed room, he laid out the entire, explosive case file. "This is going to become very public in 48 hours, David stated calmly. "My client is exercising his right to a certain brand of personal justice. When the show is over, your job begins. I want a plainclothes team inside that ballroom, ready to apprehend Isabella and Leo Hayes for conspiracy, fraud, and potential negligent homicide. No sirens, no fuss. Let her have her moment in the spotlight. It will be her last." The night before the gala, Ethan stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his apartment, looking out at the city lights. The anger and the grief had settled into a profound, almost serene calm. His suit for the evening was hanging on his door, a dark suit of armor. He wasn't nervous, he was ready. He picked up a framed photograph from his desk. It was of him and his father at a construction site 20 years ago, both wearing hard hats, his father's arm draped proudly over his shoulder. The man in the photo was strong, vibrant, and honorable. That was his father. That was the man he was fighting for. He was finally fulfilling the most important lesson Richard had ever taught him. A structure is only as strong as its foundation. Isabella had built a beautiful, glittering palace on a foundation of lies, deception, and death. And he was about to release the earthquake that would bring it all crashing down. The grand ballroom of the Omni Parker house was a symphony of calculated opulence. The air, heavy with the scent of lilies and money, hummed with the quiet, confident chatter of Boston's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, forgiving light on a sea of black-tie tuxedos and jewel-toned gowns. It was a room of immense power and influence, and tonight, Isabella Hayes was its undisputed queen. Ethan and David sat at their table near the back, an island of cold, coiled tension in the warm, flowing river of the gala. From his vantage point, Ethan watched the performance. He saw Isabella, a vision in black silk, gliding through the crowd, accepting an embrace here, a whispered word of sympathy there. Her grief was a perfectly tailored garment she wore with impeccable grace. He saw Leo at her side, his son-in-law roll polished to a high sheen, shaking hands with city councilmen and bank presidents, soaking in the reflected glory of a legacy he had helped to destroy. They were magnificent, a pair of glittering predators basking in the warmth of their successful hunt, completely unaware that the hunter's moon was about to rise. After the main course, the lights began to dim. A hush fell over the room. A single, soft spotlight found Isabella as she ascended the small staircase to the stage. She approached the lectern, dabbing a perfectly manicured finger at the corner of her eye. The audience was captivated. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice a soft, melodic tremor. "To honor a man who was more than just a builder of our city. He was the builder of my world, my husband, Richard Hayes." She spoke beautifully, her words weaving a tapestry of a great man, a loving husband, a tragic victim of a weak heart. She spoke of his integrity, his strength, his vision. Every word was a lie, polished to sound like a prayer. The hypocrisy was so profound, so absolute, it was almost a work of art. "Richard's heart was his greatest strength," she continued, her voice catching with emotion, "and it was his greatest vulnerability. That is why, in his memory, I am dedicating my life to this foundation, to fight the disease that took him from us, to ensure no other family has to suffer such a loss." She raised her head, a beatific, tragic smile on her lips. "Before we continue, I wanted to share a short film with you, a look back at the incredible man I was so proud to call my husband." This was the cue. As the ballroom lights dimmed to near darkness for the memorial video, a single figure rose from the back of the room. It was Ethan. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply began to walk toward the stage, his pace measured and deliberate. A few heads turned, then a few more. A ripple of confused whispers spread through the room. Security guards near the stage tensed, but hesitated. This was the son, not a stranger. What could they do? Isabella, her back to the room, was smiling at the large screen, waiting for the video of her husband to appear. She heard the whispers and turned, her smile faltering as she saw Ethan approaching the steps. Her confusion turned to a flicker of alarm. He ascended the stairs, his face calm and unreadable, and walked directly to the lectern beside her. He didn't look at her. He looked out at the silent, watching crowd. He adjusted the microphone. "My name is Ethan Hayes," he said, his voice quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the vast, silent room. "And my father was a great man. Isabella has told you a story tonight. And now, I'm going to tell you the truth." He gave a nearly imperceptible nod toward the A divided by V booth at the back of the room. The massive screen behind the stage, which was supposed to show images of Richard Hayes, flickered. But instead of a smiling photo, a stark white screen appeared, dominated by the corporate logo of Hayes Construction. Then, like a wound opening, a thick red line bled from the logo, snaking down to a box labeled Orion Strategic Consulting, then to another labeled Panamanian Holdings, and then to a final box, the Monet Trust, Cayman Islands. Gasps rippled through the audience. "My father's legacy wasn't just buildings," Ethan said, his voice as cold and hard as steel. "It was his integrity. This is the blueprint of how that integrity was stolen. Millions of dollars, laundered and siphoned away by the woman who claims to be honoring him." Isabella stared at the screen, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. She reached for the microphone. "What is the meaning of this? Security?" But Ethan didn't raise his voice. He simply continued, and the slide changed. Now, it was the triptych of her three faces. To understand the crime, you must first understand the criminal. Most of you know her as Isabella Hayes, but Arthur Vance of Florida knew her as Isabel Roach, and Marcus Thorne of Arizona knew her as Bella Monet. The collective intake of breath in the room was like a sudden wind. She is a phantom who collects lonely, wealthy men and leaves behind a trail of convenient death certificates. Isabella was now pale, her composure shattering. "Lies. These are all lies," she shrieked, her voice shrill and ugly. But Ethan's calm narration cut through her panic, and the screen changed again, turning completely black. And then, white text began to appear, stark and damning. A quote from Sarah Jenkins' affidavit. "And how did she do it?" Ethan asked the silent room. "How did she turn my strong, proud father into the confused, angry man he was at the end? She did it with a whisper, and she did it with a pill." He let the words hang in the air as another quote appeared on the screen. He read it aloud. "I witnessed her administering unscheduled doses of his heart medication. She referred to it as his quiet medicine to keep him manageable." The horror in the ballroom was now a living thing, a suffocating silence of absolute shock. The city's most powerful people stared, mouths agape, at the monster on the stage. Finally, Ethan turned away from the crowd and looked directly at Isabella. She was trapped, exposed, a vampire caught in the sudden blinding glare of a searchlight. His voice, when he spoke again, was low, personal, and utterly devastating. "You named this foundation for heart health, but you are a disease. You didn't just break my father's heart, you systematically poisoned it. You poisoned his body, you poisoned his mind, and with that letter, you tried to poison his legacy. But that ends tonight." He leaned into the microphone for his final words to the audience. "My father's true foundation, the one built on truth and integrity, begins its rebuilding right now." He placed the microphone gently back on the lectern. The screen behind him went black. The show was over. In the profound, ringing silence of the grand ballroom, every single eye was locked on the stage, on the crumbling queen and the avenging son who had just brought her entire world crashing down. For a long moment, the silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. It was a vacuum, a void where the air itself seemed to have been sucked out by the sheer gravity of the revelations. Hundreds of the city's most influential people sat frozen, their faces a gallery of slack-jawed disbelief. On the stage, under the unforgiving glare of the spotlights, Isabella stood as if she had been turned to stone, her face a grotesque mask of her former beauty, the carefully constructed grief having melted away to reveal the raw, ugly horror beneath. The silence was shattered not by a whisper, but by a scream. It was Isabella, a primal, guttural sound of pure, cornered rage. "Lies," she shrieked, her voice cracking, unrecognizable. She spun towards Ethan, her eyes blazing with a venom that was terrifying to behold. He's lying. He was always a jealous, spiteful boy. He hated me from the beginning because Richard loved me more. Her words, meant to be a defense, came out as a desperate, unhinged confession of the very rivalry she had engineered. Leo, his face slick with sweat, reacted with the panicked instinct of a coward. He made a lurching, clumsy move toward Ethan, his hands raised as if to push him. You bastard, you'll pay for this." Before he could take another step, the chaos erupted. The audience, shocked out of their paralysis, exploded into a roar of conversation. Phones were raised, their small red recording lights blinking like a constellation of digital vultures. The spell was broken, the queen was naked, and the court was in an uproar. It was at this precise moment of peak chaos that they appeared. 4 men and 2 women in plain clothes, who had been sitting at various tables, rose in unison. They moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency that cut through the hysteria. They were David's final chess move, the detectives from the DA office. 2 of them intercepted Leo, flanking him before he even knew what was happening. The lead detective, a calm, graying man in a well-worn suit, walked up the steps and onto the stage. He paid no attention to the cameras or the crowd. He walked directly to Isabella. "Isabella Hayes," he said, his voice low and firm, not unkind but utterly final. "I'm Detective Miller. We need you to come with us. We have a warrant for your arrest, and for the arrest of Leo Vance." Isabella stared at him, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish pulled from the water. The fight drained out of her, replaced by the cold, hard reality of the law. The game was over. There were no more lies to tell, no more performances to give. As the detectives gently but firmly escorted her and a now sobbing Leo off the stage, the flashbulbs of the press, who had swarmed in from the lobby, began to erupt. The popping lights were like a volley of gunfire, capturing the final, ignominious moments of her reign. The beautiful, philanthropic widow being led away in disgrace. Through it all, Ethan remained at the lectern, a statue in the eye of the hurricane. David Chen materialized at his side, placing a firm, grounding hand on his shoulder. "It's done, Ethan," he said quietly. "Let's go." He guided Ethan away from the microphone, down the side stairs, and through a service exit, shielding him from the frantic reporters and the ravenous eyes of the crowd. They emerged into the cool, damp Boston night, the distant sound of sirens now beginning to wail, a formal announcement of the scandal that was already rocketing across the city's digital landscape. An hour later, Ethan sat in the passenger seat of David's car, watching the rain-streaked city lights slide by. His phone, which he had placed on the dashboard, was a frantic, vibrating beacon of alerts. Hayes Hirus arrested in Charity Gala shocker. Sources allege millions stolen. Elder abuse in death of tycoon Richard Hayes. The story was no longer his. It belonged to the headlines now, to the gossip columns and the inevitable true crime podcasts. He had won. He had achieved exactly what he set out to do. He had exposed the truth. He had avenged his father. He had torn down their kingdom of lies and watched them be dragged away in chains. So why did he feel so empty? The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a vast, hollow ache in his chest. He replayed the scene in his mind, the shock on the faces of the crowd, the satisfying crack in Isabella's composure, the finality of the detective's voice. It was justice. It was victory, but it felt like ashes in his mouth. The triumph of exposing the lie did not magically heal the wounds the lie had inflicted. His victory did not bring his father back. It didn't erase the memory of their final, terrible argument. It didn't unsay the words, "You are no longer my son." Justice, he was realizing, was not the same as peace. Proving his father had been manipulated didn't change the fact that he had felt abandoned by him in his final months. Exposing Isabella's evil didn't fill the void his father's absence had left. He had won the war, but he was alone on the battlefield, surrounded by the ghosts of what had been lost. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. His fingers brushed against the folded piece of stationery he had placed there before he left his apartment. The letter. He didn't need to take it out. He knew every cruel word by heart. He had proven it was a script, a fiction, a masterpiece of deception written in his father's hand. But the handwriting was still his father's. The signature was still his father's. And the scar those words had carved into his soul was still there, a deep and permanent part of him. The victory was real. The justice was undeniable. But it was a cold and lonely comfort. The months following the gala were a blur of legal proceedings and screaming headlines. Isabella and Leo's trial became the city's biggest drama, a methodical dissection of their lies, broadcast for the world to see. The Monet Trust was frozen, the penthouse in Miami was seized, and the mountain of evidence collected by David Chen was more than enough to ensure they would spend decades behind bars. Ethan, by a court order, was placed in temporary control of Hayes Construction, tasked with the monumental job of repairing not just the company's finances, but its fractured soul. He had his name back. He had justice. But the peace he thought it would bring remained elusive. The victory was a public spectacle, but his grief was a private, silent companion. He had cleared his father's name from Isabella's influence, but he couldn't clear his own mind of his father's final, venomous words. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, a call came from a number he hadn't expected to see again. It was Mr. Albright, the family lawyer. His voice was somber. "Ethan," he said, "I know things have been chaotic, but there is one final piece of your father's business that requires your attention. Can you come to my office tomorrow?" Ethan walked into the same polished, mahogany-filled room where his world had fallen apart. The memory of that day was a ghost in the chair opposite him. Mr. Albright did not waste time with pleasantries. He unlocked a drawer in his large desk and retrieved a small, unassuming box made of dark cherry wood. He slid it across the desk. "Your father came to see me the week before he died," the lawyer began, his voice low and serious. "He looked like a man haunted. He gave me this box and a very specific set of instructions. He made me swear on my career that I would follow them to the letter." Albright paused, making sure he had Ethan's full attention. He told me, "I have just signed a new will. It is a necessary evil. But if my son is the man I raised him to be, he will not let it stand. He will fight for the truth. He will move heaven and earth to uncover the lies. My instructions were to wait. And only if and when you had successfully exposed Isabella and reclaimed your family's honor was I to give this to you." Ethan stared at the box, his heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm. With trembling hands, he opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, was a single, old-fashioned safe deposit box key and a letter, handwritten on Richard's simple, personal stationery. The handwriting was shaky, a frail imitation of the strong script he knew, but it was unmistakably his father's. He unfolded the paper. "My dearest Ethan," it began, "if you are reading this, it means you have done it. You have become the man I always knew you were, and you have proven it in the only way that now matters. I hope, with all my heart, that you can find it in yours to forgive me." The words on the page began to blur as Ethan's eyes filled with tears. The letter was a confession, a last testament from a man trapped behind enemy lines. Richard wrote that he had known, in his last months, that he was a prisoner. He knew Isabella was drugging him, isolating him, controlling him, but he was too weak, his heart too fragile, to fight her directly. He was terrified that if he resisted, she would find a way to silence him for good before he could protect his legacy. So he devised a plan. A terrible, desperate, and cruel plan. "The first will, the one that cut you out, was a lie," he wrote. "And the letter I wrote with it, Ethan, that was the hardest thing I have ever had to do. Every word was a dagger in my own heart. I had to make it so hateful, so unjust, that it would ignite the fire of righteousness I knew was inside you. I had to give you a reason to fight, not just for the money, but for your very soul. It was a monstrous gamble, a father's final, flawed bet on his son's character. I bet everything on your strength, on your integrity, on the foundation we built together. And you, my son, you did not let me down." The hollow space in Ethan's chest, the one that had been there for months, began to fill with a warm, aching light. The letter explained that the key was for a private box at a downtown bank. The next morning, Ethan went. A bank manager led him into the vault, to a small, cool metal drawer. He turned the key. Inside the box, there was no mountain of gold or bearer bonds. Instead, there was his mother's wedding ring. There was a photograph of a 10-year-old Ethan, proudly holding up the model of the cantilever bridge they had built together during the blizzard. There were a dozen of his childhood drawings, which he thought had been lost years ago. And at the bottom, there was a single, sealed document, the original, true, and legally binding will, signed and notarized a year before Isabella had even entered their lives, leaving the entirety of the Hayes estate and legacy to its rightful heir. His only son. He finally understood. The real inheritance wasn't the company or the money. It was this. It was the truth. The wound, the deep, ragged scar left by the first letter, was finally healed by the second. His father hadn't betrayed him. He had trusted him in the most profound and painful way imaginable. His final act was not one of rejection, but of a desperate, all-encompassing love. They say that blood is thicker than water, but Ethan Hayes learned that the truth is thicker still. It is the bedrock upon which all else is built, and one should never, ever underestimate the silence of a man who has endured too much. For in that silence, he may be fighting his greatest battle and writing the testament that truly matters, not with ink, but with faith. Thank you for listening. Next week, we will journey to the sun-drenched coasts of California to unravel a story of a promise broken between two brothers and a family secret that has been buried in a vineyard for over 40 years. We will see you then.